The warmth of his mouth was a shocking, searing brand against her skin, a violation so profound it eclipsed the fire spreading from the 2 small punctures on her calf. Her mind, already clouded by the venom's metallic haze, reeled. One thought, sharp and clear, cut through the panic. This is Mr. Thorne, the man whose face she had only seen in polished photographs on the mansion's walls, the phantom who ruled this marble and glass kingdom from a distance. Now he was kneeling in the grass, his expensive trousers stained green, his mouth pressed to her flesh, his hands gripping her leg with a strength that was both terrifying and grounding. Her own hand, slick with sweat, was clenched so tightly around a fistful of grass that she could feel the blades slicing into her palm. A guttural sound, a half-sob, half-scream, tore from her throat, her head thrown back as the late afternoon sun blinded her, its golden light haloing her blonde curls in a cruel, beautiful mockery of the moment's horror. He was dressed impeccably, a crisp tan shirt and a dark vest. Clothes meant for boardrooms and billion-dollar deals, not for this primal, desperate act on a sun-scorched lawn. He sucked hard, a raw, visceral sound in the sudden stillness of the garden, and then spat a mixture of blood and venom onto the pristine grass beside them. His jaw was a knot of tension, his brow furrowed in a concentration so absolute it was as if the rest of the world, his empire, his entire existence had ceased to be. There was only her, the poison, and the desperate rhythmic press of his lips. That feeling, when your life is hanging by a single fraying thread and a complete stranger becomes your entire universe, it's a feeling that shatters you. If your heart is pounding in your chest, just imagining that terrifying vulnerability, that desperate prayer for a hero, do me a favor and hit that like button. Let me know you're right here in this garden with us. But to understand how Julian Thorne, a man who moved through the world like a ghost of immense power, ended up with his mouth on his maid's leg, sucking out snake venom under the Northern California sun, you have to understand the silence that came before the scream. The story doesn't begin with a snake bite. It begins with the quiet desperation that made the garden the only place Elara Hayes could truly breathe. 2 months earlier, Elara moved through the Thorne estate like a whisper. At 23, she was a study in invisibility, her movements practiced and silent, her presence meant to be felt only in the flawless gleam of a polished surface or the perfect crispness of a freshly made bed. Her life was a ledger of red ink and mounting pressure. There were the student loans for a nursing degree she'd been forced to put on an indefinite pause, a dream gathering dust in the back of her mind. More pressingly, there were the medical bills for her younger brother, Sam. Every month, they arrived like clockwork, each envelope a fresh wave of quiet panic, a reminder of the fragile thread from which his life hung and the crushing weight of her responsibility to keep it from snapping. Working here, in this sprawling monument to modern wealth, wasn't a choice. It was a necessity. It was a daily exercise in swallowing her pride, in erasing herself for 10 hours a day, all for the paycheck that was a lifeline for her and Sam. The estate itself was a masterpiece of cold geometric beauty, perched on a hill overlooking a sliver of the Pacific. It was less a home and more a museum, curated by a man with a taste for minimalism and an aversion to clutter, both material and emotional. Elara polished Italian marble floors that reflected a life she couldn't begin to fathom. She dusted art pieces that cost more than she would earn in a lifetime. She tended to cavernous rooms that held more silence than the local library, each piece of furniture placed with architectural precision, each surface gleaming under the recessed lighting. It was a beautiful, sterile world, and she was the ghost who kept it pristine. The heart of the estate for her was not within its walls but outside. The garden. It was a sprawling, magnificent creation, a symphony of controlled wilderness that stood in stark contrast to the house's rigid order. Manicured lawns gave way to bursts of wild lavender and sprawling oak trees, and at its very center, the part she loved most, was the heirloom rose garden. It was a chaotic, beautiful tangle of velvet petals and vicious thorns, a living testament to the woman who had planted it years ago, Julian Thorne's late wife. It was the only part of the property that felt truly alive, the only section that hadn't been perfectly trimmed and sculpted into submission. Here among the Queen Elizabeths and the Mr. Lincolns, surrounded by the sweet, heavy scent of blooming roses, Elara could finally exhale. She could forget, for a few precious moments, the weight of the bills and the ache in her heart for the life she was supposed to be living. Julian Thorne himself was as remote and unknowable as the satellites his company, Thorne Dynamics, launched into the silent void of space. He was a myth, forged in the unforgiving furnace of Silicon Valley and Wall Street, a billionaire who had built an empire on logic, precision, and a chillingly accurate ability to predict the future of technology. He moved with a purpose that left no room for error or emotion. Elara rarely saw him. His instructions were delivered through the head housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, a woman as starched and severe as her uniform. His presence in the house was a rare and disruptive event, a subtle shift in the atmosphere, like a change in barometric pressure before a storm. The few times their paths had crossed in a hallway, she had instinctively flattened herself against the wall, her eyes fixed on the floor, feeling the gravitational pull of his presence. Once, just once, she had dared to look up, and her gaze was met by his. His eyes were the color of a winter storm, chips of grey ice that seemed to see everything and reveal nothing. They held no malice but no warmth either. It was a look of pure, dispassionate assessment, as if he were analyzing a line of code for flaws. In that fleeting second, she understood. He wasn't just a man who owned a fortress, he was the fortress. He had built walls around himself so high, they cast a permanent shadow over his own life, a defense against a past she couldn't imagine, a past that had clearly taught him that emotion was a weakness and connection was a liability. Her world was one of Windex and wood polish, of aching feet and the constant low-grade hum of anxiety. His was a world of encrypted calls and transatlantic flights, of decisions that could shift global markets. They existed in the same physical space, but on entirely different planes of reality, separated by an invisible chasm of wealth and power. She knew him only through the artifacts of his life, the collection of rare first-edition books in his library, the half-empty glass of expensive whiskey left on his desk, the faint, clean scent of his cologne that lingered in a room long after he had gone. Her brother Sam was the sun around which her universe revolved. At 17, he should have been worried about college applications and prom dates. Instead, his life was a cycle of doctor's appointments, treatments, and days when the simple act of getting out of bed was a monumental victory. He had a rare autoimmune disorder that was slowly, relentlessly attacking his nervous system. The experimental treatments were his only hope, and they were ruinously expensive. Every dollar Elara earned went to that cause. She lived in a tiny, cramped apartment an hour's drive from the estate, ate instant noodles more often than she cared to admit, and wore clothes from the thrift store. Her sacrifices were a secret she kept locked away, a silent promise to the boy whose smile was the only real light in her life. She spoke to him on the phone every night during her break, her voice bright and cheerful, never letting on how tired she was, how close to the breaking point she often felt. He would tell her about the book he was reading or a funny movie he'd watched, and for 15 minutes, she wasn't a maid in a billionaire's mansion. She was just a big sister, and everything felt almost normal. One sweltering August afternoon, the air was thick and heavy, hanging over the manicured lawns like a wet blanket. The heat shimmered above the asphalt of the long, winding driveway. Inside the climate-controlled stillness of the house, Elara finished her duties, the final swipe of her cloth across a vast glass table, leaving an impeccable, streak-free shine. Mrs. Gable gave her a curt nod of dismissal, and Elara felt the familiar wave of relief. Her shift was over, but instead of heading straight for her car, she felt the pull of the garden. She needed a moment, just a few minutes to feel the sun on her skin and smell something other than lemon-scented cleaner. She changed out of her crisp pink and white uniform and into her own simple clothes, but the image of her as the maid, the servant, lingered. She walked towards the rose garden, her sanctuary. The heat was even more intense out here, the air buzzing with the drone of insects. She noticed a cluster of stubborn weeds choking the base of a particularly magnificent Queen Elizabeth rosebush, its pink blossoms heavy on their stems. It was technically the groundskeeper's job, but she felt a protective urge. This was her place. With a sigh, she knelt in the soft grass, the heat of the earth seeping through her thin trousers, and began to work, her fingers skillfully separating the weeds from the roots of the rose. The rhythmic motion was soothing, a simple, tangible task in a life filled with complex, intangible problems. She didn't hear the faint rustle in the dense foliage behind the bush. She didn't see the flicker of a patterned coil in the dappled shadows. She was lost in thought, her mind a million miles away, calculating co-pays and prescription costs, when a searing electric pain shot up her leg, a pain so sharp and so sudden it felt like being struck by lightning. A strangled gasp tore from her lungs, a sound of pure animal shock. Elara stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth as her eyes snapped down to her calf. Coiled in the deep shade beneath the rose leaves was a serpent, its body a tapestry of copper and brown, its triangular head a menacing jewel in the dappled sunlight. For a frozen heartbeat, their eyes met. Then, with a speed that defied comprehension, it struck again, a blur of motion, its fangs sinking into her flesh just an inch below the first bite. A second, more violent wave of fire erupted in her leg. With a final contemptuous flick of its tail, the copperhead slithered away, disappearing into the dense foliage as if it had never been there at all. All that remained was the evidence, etched into her skin. 2 sets of twin puncture wounds, small and deceptively neat, already beginning to swell and discolor into an angry purplish bruise. A single glistening drop of venom oozed from one of the marks. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. It was a physical thing, a block of ice forming in her chest and spreading through her veins, chilling her from the inside out. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, wild drumbeat of pure terror. Snake, poison, Sam. The thoughts were fragmented, nonsensical shards of fear. She had to call for help. Her phone. It was in the pocket of her trousers. She fumbled for it, her fingers clumsy and numb, her hands shaking so violently she could barely grasp the smooth plastic. When she finally managed to pull it out, the screen was a blinding, incomprehensible smear of icons. Her vision was starting to tunnel, the vibrant colors of the garden, the brilliant pinks of the roses, the impossible green of the lawn, blurring at the edges. A strange metallic taste like old pennies filled her mouth. The world began to tilt on its axis. Her knees buckled, and she sank to the grass, the phone slipping from her nerveless fingers. Her breath came in ragged, shallow gasps that did nothing to fill her screaming lungs. She was going to die here, alone, in a billionaire's garden, killed by a snake. The sheer, tragic absurdity of it was the last coherent thought she had before the haze began to consume her. It was in this fog of encroaching darkness that a figure materialized, moving with impossible speed from the direction of the glass-walled patio. At first she thought he was a mirage, a hallucination conjured by the venom, but then he was there, kneeling beside her, and the world snapped back into terrifyingly sharp focus. Julian Thorne. He had been in his study, a vast minimalist space that overlooked the gardens, engaged in a rare moment of stillness. His gaze had been fixed on the chaotic beauty of his late wife's roses when her cry, a sound so raw and out of place in the estate's curated silence, had sliced through the air. He was across the lawn in seconds, his movements not hurried but ruthlessly economical, each stride powered by a latent energy she had never suspected. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't waste a single second on questions. His glacial grey eyes took in the entire scene in a single sweeping glance. Her crumpled form, the terror on her face, the rapidly spreading discoloration on her calf, and the telltale serpentine pattern in the disturbed grass where the snake had been. Something in his eyes shifted then. The detached, analytical ice melted away, replaced by a focused primal intensity that was more frightening and more reassuring than anything she had ever seen. "Stay still," he commanded. His voice was not the clipped, distant tone of a CEO, but a low, authoritative growl that cut through the fog of her panic and anchored her to the moment. He moved with a speed and certainty that was mesmerizing. He grabbed the hem of her simple maid's apron, which she'd tied around her waist over her trousers, and with one powerful motion ripped a long strip of the pink and white fabric free. He knelt lower, his proximity a dizzying shock, and expertly tied the strip a few inches above the swelling wounds. It was tight, but not tight enough to cut off her circulation entirely. He was not trying to stop the blood flow. He was trying to slow the venom's relentless march through her lymphatic system. She knew this instinctively, a faint echo from her first-year nursing textbooks, but her mind was too scattered to fully process it. Then he did something so unexpected, so utterly inconceivable, that it shattered every boundary between them, every rule of their separate, unequal worlds. He lowered his head, took her injured calf in his large, warm hands, and pressed his mouth to the wound. The shock of it was a jolt, almost as potent as the venom itself. It was an act of shocking intimacy, an archaic, desperate gesture that belonged to a different century. The warmth of his mouth, the faint bristle of his 5 o'clock shadow against her cold, clammy skin, sent a tremor through her entire body. He sucked hard, his cheeks hollowing, the sound raw and desperate in the stillness of the garden. He spat the poison-laced saliva onto the perfect grass, his jaw tight with concentration, a muscle flexing in his temple. Then he did it again, and again. Each time he was drawing out not just the venom, but every social construct that had defined them. In that moment, kneeling in the grass under the sweltering August sun, they were not employer and employee, not billionaire and maid. They were stripped down to the most basic, elemental components of humanity. One person dying and another fighting like hell to stop it. He was pulling the poison from her veins, and in doing so he was exposing a part of himself he had kept buried under layers of wealth, power, and impenetrable isolation. Elara could only watch, dizzy and disoriented, as this formidable, unreadable man saved her life. When he finally pulled back for the last time, his lips were stained with her blood. His breathing was heavy, his face grim. He looked at her, his grey eyes searching her own, and for the first time she saw not an employer but a man who seemed to be wrestling with a force inside himself. Without a word, he shifted, scooping her into his arms as if she weighed nothing. The strength in his arms was another surprise, a contradiction to his lean, tailored appearance. He held her securely against his chest and began to stride towards the house. "Marcus!" he bellowed, his voice echoing across the manicured lawns, charged with an urgency that seemed to shake the very air. "Get the car, now!" The silent, polished tomb of the mansion erupted into quiet chaos as he carried her through the doors. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, appeared in the main hall, her normally severe face a mask of shock. Two other maids peeked out from a doorway, their eyes wide with disbelief. Julian Thorne ignored them all. His focus was a laser beam, fixed entirely on Elara, his stride never faltering as he carried her through the vast marble foyer and out the front entrance, where a sleek black sedan was already pulling up, the tires crunching on the gravel. The ride to the hospital was a blur of motion and fading consciousness. The pain in her leg was a roaring fire, and waves of nausea washed over her. Through it all, one thing remained constant: Julian Thorne's hand gripping hers. It wasn't a gentle, comforting touch. It was a hard, anchoring presence, a silent promise in the storm of pain and fear. She drifted in and out, catching snippets of his voice as he spoke on the phone. The cool, precise authority was back, but now it was directed at an emergency room doctor. "I'm 5 minutes out with a snakebite victim. Probable copperhead. 2 distinct bites to the lower left calf. Patient is a 23-year-old female, approximately 115 pounds. She's displaying signs of systemic envenomation, localized swelling and discoloration, nausea, tachycardia, and some mental confusion. Will be at your trauma bay entrance." The medical terminology flowed from him with an ease that made no sense. This wasn't the language of a tech billionaire. It was the language of a doctor, a paramedic. The hospital was a whirlwind of bright lights, beeping machines, and urgent voices. A team was waiting for them, and they swarmed the car the moment it stopped. They loaded her onto a gurney, and for a moment, Julian's grip on her hand tightened before they were forced to separate. He walked alongside the gurney as they rushed her inside, his face a grim, unreadable mask, never taking his eyes off her until they disappeared through a set of swinging doors marked "No Entry." The hours that followed were a haze of IV drips, anti-venom, and the dull, throbbing ache in her leg. The pain slowly receded, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. She drifted in a twilight state between sleep and wakefulness. The image of Julian Thorne's blood-stained mouth burned into her memory. Later, when the world had sharpened back into focus, she overheard 2 nurses talking in hushed tones just outside the curtain of her cubicle. "Can you believe that was him?" "Julian Thorne," one whispered, her voice filled with awe. "He just carried her in like something out of a movie." "Forget that," the second nurse replied, her voice even lower. "Did you hear him giving the report? He knew exactly what to look for, exactly what to say." Dr. Evans was impressed. Thorne told him he was a medic way back when. Special Forces. Said his training just kicked in. A medic. Special Forces. The words hung in the air, rearranging everything Elara thought she knew about the man. The cold, distant billionaire who commanded boardrooms and built empires had once been a soldier who commanded life and death in desolate, forgotten landscapes. He hadn't saved her out of some sense of employer's duty. He had saved her because it was who he was, long before he became the man the world saw. It was an instinct, buried deep but never forgotten. A short while later, the curtain was pushed aside. Julian Thorne stood there, his impeccable clothes now rumpled and stained with grass and her blood. The primal intensity was gone, replaced by a quiet, watchful stillness that was somehow more unnerving. The ice was back in his eyes, but it seemed different now, thinner, as if covering a great depth she was only just beginning to perceive. The vast unspoken chasm between their worlds had been crossed in an act of primal desperation, and now they stood on the other side of it, lost in an awkward, unfamiliar landscape. He looked from her pale face to the IV bag dripping life-saving fluid into her arm. For a long moment he said nothing. The silence stretched, filled with the weight of everything that had happened, everything that had changed between a scream and a whisper. Finally his voice, low and steady, broke the quiet. "The doctors say you're going to be fine," he said. It was a simple statement of fact, but beneath it Elara heard something else, an echo of the life and death struggle in the garden, a final, quiet command for her to live. The immediate danger was over, but as she looked into the eyes of the man who had held her life in his hands and pressed his lips to her skin, she knew that a new and far more complicated one had just begun. The aftermath was a landscape of awkward tenderness, a fragile new reality, built in the space between a near-death experience and a life irrevocably altered. Julian Thorne, a man who orchestrated his existence with the precision of a military operation, now found himself navigating a situation for which there was no protocol, no blueprint. He insisted, with a finality that brooked no argument, that Elara recover at the estate. Her protests were weak, born of a lifetime of not wanting to be a burden, but they crumbled under the quiet force of his will. "It's a matter of logistics," he stated, his voice clipped and devoid of emotion, as if discussing a corporate acquisition. "The doctors require you to have round-the-clock observation for the next 72 hours. My staff can provide that. It's the most efficient solution." Efficient. He used the word like a shield, a way to frame his unprecedented concern in the familiar, sterile language of business. But Elara saw through it. She saw the flicker of something else in his eyes, something he quickly concealed, a shadow of the man who had knelt in the grass, his face a mask of grim determination. She was installed in a guest suite that was larger than her entire apartment. It was a space of muted creams and soft greys, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the very garden where she had almost died. It felt like a gilded cage, beautiful and suffocating. A private nurse, a kind, motherly woman named Clara, was hired to attend to her. Meals appeared on silent trolleys, exquisite dishes she had only ever seen being prepared for him. When she tried to talk about the medical bills, a wave of anxiety washing over her at the thought of the astronomical cost of the anti-venom and the hospital stay, Julian dismissed the concern with a single, impatient wave of his hand. "That has been handled," he said, his tone making it clear the subject was closed. He was erasing her debts, but in doing so, he was creating a new one, an intangible obligation that felt heavier and more suffocating than any monetary sum. He was a man accustomed to transactions, to clear debits and credits, but this was something else entirely. This was a debt of flesh and blood, and neither of them knew how to balance the ledger. His presence was a constant, unnerving hum in the background of her recovery. He wasn't hovering, but he was always there. He would appear at her door in the morning with a stack of newspapers and leave them on a table without a word. He would sit in an armchair in the corner of the vast room while she slept, the faint glow of his tablet illuminating the sharp planes of his face as he worked, a silent, watchful guardian. Their conversations were stilted and brief, islands of awkward small talk in a sea of unspoken things. He would ask how she was feeling, and she would say, "Better," and he would nod, and the silence would rush back in to fill the space between them. The incident had forged an invisible, unbreakable thread between them, a bond of shared trauma and primal connection. He, who had walled himself off from all human contact, now felt an undeniable, almost suffocating responsibility for the young woman whose life he had held in his hands. And she, who had only ever known conditional support and the constant struggle for survival, was overwhelmed by a gratitude so profound it felt like a form of paralysis. "How do you thank a man for saving your life?" The words "thank you" felt laughably inadequate, hollow trinkets offered in exchange for a priceless gift. One afternoon, as she was propped up against a mountain of pillows, reading a worn paperback she'd asked one of the maids to retrieve from her apartment, he entered the room carrying a small, beautifully wrapped box. He placed it on the bed beside her. "A distraction," he said, his voice as neutral as ever. Inside was the latest, most advanced tablet on the market, preloaded with subscriptions to every streaming service and news outlet imaginable. It was a gesture of immense generosity, and yet it felt like another wall being built between them. He didn't know what she liked, what she read, what she cared about. He only knew how to solve problems with money. She looked from the sleek, cold device to the tattered book of Emily Dickinson poetry in her hands. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice quiet. "It's very thoughtful." He simply nodded, his gaze lingering for a moment on the book's worn cover before he turned and left, leaving her alone with the silence and the ghost of the man he used to be. The chasm between them had been bridged for one terrifying afternoon, but now it seemed to be reforming, wider and more impassable than ever. This new, strange proximity did not go unnoticed. The estate staff, accustomed to a rigid and unbreachable hierarchy, now whispered in the hallways. They saw the way Mr. Thorne's routine had been disrupted, the way his focus seemed to drift towards the east wing, where Elara was recovering. But the most acute observer of this shift was a woman for whom observation was a finely honed weapon, Julian's fiancée, Genevieve Sterling. Genevieve was a woman as polished and transactional as a corporate merger. She was the daughter of an old money dynasty, a perfect counterpart to Julian's new money empire. Their engagement was a strategic alliance, a union of power and influence that had been celebrated on the society pages. She moved through the world with an unshakable lacquered confidence, her smile a beautiful, sharp thing, her eyes missing nothing. She arrived at the estate 2 days after the incident, her silver convertible crunching on the gravel, her presence announced by the faint, expensive scent of her perfume. She found Julian in his study, staring out at the garden. "Darling," she said, her voice a smooth, cultured purr as she kissed his cheek. "I came as soon as I heard. How ghastly. Is the poor girl all right?" Her concern was a perfect performance, but Julian for the first time found himself noticing the artifice. He saw the way her eyes scanned the room, the faint, almost imperceptible tightening of her jaw. He told her the story, editing it down to the bare, clinical facts. He omitted the visceral details, the fear, the blood, the shocking intimacy of the moment. But Genevieve's intuition was sharp. She sensed that something more than a simple rescue had occurred in that garden. The next afternoon, she paid a visit to the guest suite. Elara was sitting by the window, her leg propped up on an ottoman, when Genevieve glided in, a vision in white linen. "Elara, is it?" she said, her smile as bright and hard as a diamond. "I'm Genevieve, Julian's fiancée. I just had to come and see how you were doing. We were all so terribly worried." She sat in the armchair Julian usually occupied, crossing her long legs elegantly. She spoke of gratitude, of Julian's innate heroism, her words dripping with a condescension so subtle it was almost imperceptible. She painted the picture of a benevolent king and his grateful subject, reinforcing the very hierarchy that had been shattered in the grass. Then, from her chic leather handbag, she produced a checkbook. With a flourish of a gold pen, she wrote out a check and placed it on the bedside table, face up. "A small token of our appreciation," she said, her voice softening into a conspiratorial whisper, "for your trouble. We feel it's important that you're able to get a fresh start. Somewhere else, perhaps, where you can feel safe." The amount on the check was staggering. It was more money than Elara had ever seen in her life. It was enough to pay for all of Sam's treatments for the next decade. It was freedom. It was a future. It was everything she had been fighting for, praying for, sacrificing for. But as she looked at the crisp paper, at the elegant, looping signature, she saw it for what it truly was: a dismissal, a bribe, an attempt to sever the invisible thread, to buy back the piece of Julian he had revealed in the garden, to erase the bond that had been forged in a moment of shared mortality. It was an attempt to turn a profound human act back into a simple transaction. A wave of something hot and unfamiliar washed over her, not gratitude but a fierce, protective anger, an anger on behalf of the man who had saved her and on behalf of the sacredness of what they had shared. She pushed the check back across the smooth surface of the table. "I don't want his money," Elara said, her voice shaking but firm. Genevieve's smile tightened, a barely perceptible crack in her flawless facade. "Oh, my dear," she cooed, her condescension now undisguised. "Everyone wants his money. It's just a matter of how you ask for it." The implication was ugly and clear. Elara was a schemer, a gold digger playing the long game. The insult stung more than the snake's venom had. Genevieve stood up, leaving the check on the table. "Think about it," she said, her voice turning cool. "It's the best offer you're going to get." Genevieve, however, was not a woman who left things to chance. Frustrated by Elara's unexpected refusal, she deployed a more insidious strategy. That evening she found Julian on the patio, a glass of whiskey in his hand. She wrapped her arms around him, her head on his shoulder, the picture of concerned devotion. "I spoke with the girl, Julian," she began, her voice a careful symphony of worry and reluctance. "She's very sweet, but she's also in a difficult position." She paused, letting the silence hang in the air. She kept talking about her brother, about his medical bills. "She's grateful, of course, but she's also aware of the opportunity this situation presents, the liability." She chose her words with surgical precision. She would never be so crass as to say it outright, but I got the distinct impression she's considering her options. A lawsuit, perhaps. It's only natural, I suppose, given her circumstances. A girl like that, a chance like this. The words were a slow-acting poison designed to trigger the very defenses Julian had spent a lifetime building. He had seen the world at its most cynical and transactional. He had been surrounded by people who saw him not as a man, but as a walking vault of opportunity. He had built his walls for a reason. For a moment, the old Julian, the ruthless, distrusting magnate who saw traps and angles in every human interaction, surfaced. The ice in his eyes hardened, refreezing solid. He remembered seeing the check on her bedside table earlier, untouched. He had been puzzled, even impressed by it. But Genevieve's words twisted the scene, reframing it not as an act of dignity, but as a calculated negotiation tactic. She's holding out for more. The thought was a venom far more potent than the copperhead's, because it came from a poison he had carried within himself for years. The next morning, he went to her room. The awkward tenderness was gone, replaced by a cold, businesslike distance. The walls were back up, higher and more impenetrable than ever. "Elara," he said, his voice clipped and formal. He didn't come any further than the doorway. "Genevieve mentioned your conversation. If this is a matter of compensation, let me be clear. You should speak to my legal team. They will handle it from here on out. We can arrange a generous settlement to ensure your silence and prevent any future complications." The words struck Elara with the force of a physical blow, harder than the snake's fangs had. It wasn't just an accusation. It was a fundamental rejection, a negation of the profound, terrifying human moment they had shared. He wasn't seeing her, the woman whose life he had saved. He was seeing a problem to be managed, a liability to be contained, another transaction to be closed. He had retreated back inside his fortress, and from its cold stone ramparts he had judged her and found her guilty. Heartbreak, sharp and swift, lanced through her. She had been so foolish to think anything had truly changed. She was the maid. He was the billionaire. That was the beginning and the end of their story. The rest was just a temporary delusion, a fever dream brought on by snake venom. Her pride, the one thing she had left that was entirely her own, surged. She would not stay another minute in a place where she was seen as a threat, a parasite. With a quiet dignity she didn't know she possessed, she looked him straight in the eye. "There will be no need for your lawyers, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. "I'll be gone within the hour." He just stared at her, his face an unreadable mask, and for a moment she thought she saw a flicker of something behind the ice. Confusion, regret, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. He gave a curt, single nod and turned away, leaving her alone in the beautiful, silent room that had become her prison. Tears pricked at the corners of Elara's eyes, hot and sharp, but she refused to let them fall. She would not cry, not here, not in his house, where her pain would be just another mess for someone else to clean up. The heartbreak was a physical ache in her chest, a hollow space where a fragile, nascent hope had begun to grow. It had been a foolish hope, she now realized, a weed growing in the cracks of a concrete reality. What had she expected? That a moment of shared terror could erase a lifetime of difference? That the man who commanded empires would see her as anything more than a fleeting complication in his perfectly ordered world? The bitterness of her own naivety was a fouler taste than the venom had been. With a slow, deliberate calmness, she swung her legs off the bed. Her calf was still tender, wrapped in a clean white bandage, a stark reminder of the event that had both brought them together and now torn them apart. Each movement was a small act of defiance. She would not be the helpless victim he now saw her as. She packed her few belongings into the worn canvas bag a maid had retrieved from her apartment. A change of clothes, a toothbrush, and her tattered copy of Emily Dickinson's poems. It was a meager collection, a testament to a life lived on the narrowest of margins. The room, with its luxurious furnishings and breathtaking view, seemed to mock her. The sleek, expensive tablet he had given her sat on the bedside table, a cold, dark mirror reflecting her pale, drawn face. She left it there next to Genevieve's check. She wouldn't take anything that wasn't hers. His money, his gifts, his suspicions, she would leave them all behind. Before she zipped the bag, she paused, her fingers hovering over the poetry book. It was the one object she owned that felt like a true piece of herself, a connection to the girl she had been before her life became a relentless series of sacrifices. On an impulse she didn't fully understand, she opened it to a page she had marked long ago. With a pen from the desk, she drew a faint, neat line under a single sentence. It was a quiet, final message, a whisper into the void she knew he would never hear. She placed the book on the pristine white duvet, its worn cover a small, shabby protest in the room's sterile perfection. Then, without a backward glance, she walked out of the suite, down the long, silent hallway, and out of Julian Thorne's life. She moved like a ghost, just as she had when she first arrived, leaving no trace of her presence except for a small, underlined verse and the lingering scent of betrayal. Hours passed. Julian found himself unable to work. The lines of code on his screen blurred into meaningless symbols. The usual ruthless focus that was his trademark had deserted him, replaced by a restless, gnawing unease. Genevieve's theory had seemed so logical, so consistent with his experience of the world. And yet, Elara's reaction, the quiet, wounded dignity in her eyes as she'd announced her departure, didn't fit the profile of a scheming opportunist. A schemer would have argued, negotiated, threatened. She had simply left. He walked through the silent mansion, the unease growing with every step, until he found himself standing at the door of the guest suite. He pushed it open. The room was empty, stripped of her presence. The bed was perfectly made, the pillows fluffed. It was as if she had never been there, but then he saw it. Lying in the exact center of the vast bed was her book. He walked over and picked it up. The cover was soft with age, the pages yellowed. It felt like a living thing in his hands, imbued with a history and a warmth that was absent from everything else in his house. He opened it to the page marked by a folded corner. A single line was underlined in faint black ink. That it will never come again is what makes life so sweet. The words hit him with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't a plea. It was a statement of profound, heartbreaking truth. It was the quiet lament of a soul who understood the fleeting, precious nature of a moment. This was not the gesture of a greedy woman angling for a bigger settlement. It was the farewell of a poet, a quiet soul who had experienced a moment of raw, terrifying, beautiful connection and was now mourning its loss. The foundation of his cynicism began to crack. He saw the untouched check on the bedside table, and for the first time he understood. Refusing it wasn't a strategy. It was a matter of principle. She hadn't wanted his money. She had wanted, what? For him to see her? For him to acknowledge the truth of what had happened between them in the garden? The unease in his gut curdled into a cold, sickening certainty. He had made a terrible mistake. Genevieve. Her words, so perfectly crafted, so logical, now replayed in his mind with a sinister new resonance. He turned and strode out of the room, his long legs eating up the distance to the security office in the mansion's basement, a place he hadn't set foot in for years. "Show me the footage," he commanded the startled guard on duty. The guest suite in the East Wing, yesterday afternoon. He watched the silent, grainy footage on the monitor. There was Genevieve gliding into the room, her smile a bright slash of red lipstick. He saw her talk, her gestures elegant and dismissive. He saw her place the check on the table, and then he saw Elara. He saw her small, determined shake of the head. He saw her push the check back across the table, her posture straight, her chin lifted. There was no hesitation, no calculation. There was only a quiet, unshakable dignity. And then he saw the flicker of fury in Genevieve's eyes, a micro-expression of venomous anger. So quick he would have missed it if he hadn't been looking for it. The truth crashed down on him with the weight of a physical object, knocking the air from his lungs. Genevieve hadn't been reporting a suspicion. She had been planting one. She had seen the bond forged in the garden not as a miracle, but as a threat to her own position. She had deliberately twisted Elara's dignity into a weapon against her. He hadn't just misjudged Elara. He had betrayed her. He had taken the purest, most profoundly human thing that had happened to him in years and allowed the poison of his own cynical world to corrupt it. He had looked at a woman who had shown him a sliver of his own forgotten humanity and called her a thief. The shame was a physical burn, searing him from the inside out. He had survived war zones, hostile takeovers, and corporate espionage, but this quiet, self-inflicted wound felt like the most grievous he had ever sustained. He didn't hesitate. He walked back to his study, where Genevieve was on the phone, finalizing arrangements for a charity gala. She smiled at him as he entered, a bright, possessive smile that now looked predatory to him. He walked to his desk and, with a calm, deliberate movement, swept her framed photo into the wastebasket. Her smile vanished. "Julian, what on earth—" "It's over, Genevieve," he said, his voice flat and cold, devoid of all emotion. "Get your things. I want you out of this house in an hour." Her face, for the first time since he'd met her, registered genuine shock, which quickly morphed into rage. "You're throwing me out? For a maid? A nobody?" "I'm throwing you out," he corrected her, his voice lethally quiet. "Because you lied to me. Because you tried to destroy someone who is worth more than your entire family's portfolio. You saw goodness, and you tried to poison it. I will not have that in my life." He turned and walked away, leaving her sputtering in his wake, the broken pieces of their strategic alliance scattered on the floor. Finding Elara was another matter. She had no car. Her apartment was empty, the landlord informing his security team that she had paid her final month's rent in cash and left the key on the counter. She had vanished. For a man with near infinite resources, it should have been a simple task, but Elara Hayes lived a life almost entirely off the grid. She had no credit cards, no social media presence, no digital footprint to follow. She was a ghost. For 2 days, Julian unleashed the full force of his resources. His best security people, men who could find anyone, anywhere, worked around the clock. They scoured bus station manifests, checked homeless shelters, interviewed her former neighbors, and through it all, a cold dread grew in Julian's heart. What if she was truly gone? What if he never had the chance to atone for his mistake? The underlined line from her book haunted him, that it will never come again. They finally found her at a bus station in a rundown, forgotten corner of San Francisco. She was sitting on a hard plastic bench, her small canvas bag at her feet, waiting for a coach that would take her back to a small town in the Central Valley, back to a life of struggle and anonymity. The photo his security chief sent him was grainy, taken from a distance, but it was unmistakably her. Her shoulders were slumped, her face pale and tired. She looked smaller, more fragile than he remembered. He was in his car in minutes, the sleek sedan a stark alien presence in the gritty, neglected neighborhood. He saw her through the grimy glass of the terminal window before she saw him. He got out of the car, his heart pounding in a way it hadn't since he was a young man in a desert war zone. He didn't come with lawyers or checkbooks. He didn't come with promises of wealth. He came with nothing but the raw, sickening weight of his own failure. He walked into the terminal, the scent of diesel fumes and stale coffee filling the air. He stopped a few feet in front of her. Her head was down, her gaze fixed on her worn sneakers. "Elara," he said, his voice hoarse. Her head snapped up. Her eyes widened, a complex storm of emotions swirling in their depths. Shock, fear, and a deep, guarded hurt. She looked like a startled fawn, ready to bolt at the slightest provocation. She stood up, clutching her bag to her chest like a shield. "What are you doing here, Mr. Thorne?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Did you bring your lawyers to serve me papers?" The words were a quiet, devastating indictment of his actions. "No," he said, the word raw in his throat. He took a step closer, holding his hands up in a gesture of surrender. "I came to apologize." He looked into her wounded eyes, and stripped himself of all his usual armor. "I was wrong," he said, his voice stripped of its command, its precision, its power. It was just the voice of a man, flawed and broken. "What I said to you, it was unforgivable. I let my world, my cynicism, I let Genevieve, I let it all poison what happened between us. What you did, refusing that check, you showed me a kind of integrity I had forgotten existed, and I threw it back in your face. I am so sorry." She just stared at him, her expression unreadable. He continued, the words tumbling out, clumsy and unrehearsed. "I saw the security footage, Elara. I know what she did. And I know what I did. I broke your trust, and I betrayed a part of myself I thought was long dead. A part you reminded me of." He told her he had ended his engagement with Genevieve. He told her he had spent 2 days searching for her, terrified he had lost his one chance to make things right. He didn't offer to buy her a new life. He didn't offer her a check. Instead, he offered her a partnership. "Let me fix this," he pleaded, his voice cracking with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "Not with a settlement, with a real investment. In you. Let me fund your education. Let me cover all of your brother's medical needs, no strings attached. Not as charity, not as payment, as an investment in someone I believe in, someone who is better than I am." He took another step, closing the distance between them until they were only inches apart. "You saved me too, Elara," he confessed, the admission costing him more than any billion-dollar deal ever had. "In that garden, you reminded me that some things aren't for sale. You reminded me what it feels like to be human." The story didn't end there, in the grime and noise of a bus station. It didn't end with a fairy tale wedding or a sudden magical transformation. It ended with a beginning, with 2 broken people standing in the wreckage of their own assumptions, choosing to build something new. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not the billionaire but the man, the former medic, the lonely soul who had built a fortress around his heart, and in his eyes she saw a raw, desperate hope that mirrored her own. Slowly, cautiously, she gave a single, tentative nod. The maid was bitten by a snake in the garden. The billionaire saved her life by sucking out the venom. In doing so, he had drawn out the poison that had been slowly, silently killing them both, making room for something real, something fragile, and something profoundly alive to finally grow in its place. The return to the estate was a study in surreal contrasts. The sleek, silent sedan whisked them away from the grit and despair of the bus station, gliding through the city streets and onto the coastal highway. Inside the car, an entirely different kind of quiet reigned, one thick with unspoken questions and fragile possibilities. Elara sat stiffly in the plush leather seat, her small canvas bag a shabby refugee on the floor beside her. She kept stealing glances at the man in the driver's seat. It was Julian. He had dismissed his driver, choosing to take the wheel himself, another small but significant crack in the armor of his carefully constructed world. His hands, which she now knew were capable of both building empires and staunching wounds, rested lightly on the steering wheel. His profile was a sharp, focused silhouette against the backdrop of the setting sun, which was bleeding streaks of orange and purple across the Pacific. He was no longer Mr. Thorne, the distant, untouchable magnate. He was Julian, a man who had confessed his own brokenness in the middle of a bus terminal. And she was no longer the maid, the invisible cog in his household machine. She was Elara, a woman he had invested in, a woman he had apologized to with a rawness that had shaken her to her core. They were 2 survivors, returning to the scene of a trauma, not as master and servant, but as something new, something undefined and terrifyingly fragile. As they drove through the imposing gates of the Thorne estate, Elara felt a tremor of anxiety. This place was a symbol of her invisibility, her powerlessness. Now she was re-entering it not through the staff entrance, but as a guest, an equal. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, was waiting for them at the front door, her face an impassive mask that betrayed nothing of what she must be thinking. "Welcome back, Miss Hayes," she said, her voice perfectly neutral, but her eyes, for a fraction of a second, flickered with surprise as Julian took Elara's small bag from her hand. "I'll have the East Wing suite prepared for you." "No," Julian said, his voice quiet but firm. "Prepare the West Wing suite, the one next to mine." Mrs. Gable's composure finally cracked. Her eyebrows shot up, a barely perceptible but seismic shift. The West Wing was the private heart of the mansion, reserved for family. Placing Elara there was not a logistical decision. It was a statement, a redrawing of the map of his world. The days that followed were a delicate, awkward dance. Julian was true to his word. The next morning, a team of lawyers, not his corporate sharks but a quiet, compassionate woman from a private firm, met with Elara. They didn't present her with non-disclosure agreements or settlement papers. Instead, they set up a trust, an irrevocable fund dedicated to covering every single one of Sam's past, present, and future medical expenses. Another trust was established for her education, enough to cover tuition, books, and living expenses at any university she chose, for any degree she wanted to pursue. It was all done with a quiet, respectful efficiency that left no room for her to feel like a charity case. It was, as he had promised, an investment. When she tried to thank him, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name, he simply shook his head. "This is me, balancing the ledger, Elara," he said, his gaze steady. "The debt is mine, not yours." He was determined to dismantle the walls he had built, brick by painful brick. He started joining her for meals, not at the cavernous dining table that could seat 20, but at a small, intimate table on the patio overlooking the garden. At first, their conversations were stilted, circling around safe, impersonal topics, the weather, the news, the books she was reading. But slowly, tentatively, they began to share pieces of themselves. She told him about Sam, about his relentless optimism in the face of his illness, his dry wit, his passion for astronomy. As she spoke, she saw a flicker of genuine empathy in Julian's eyes, a softening around his mouth. He, in turn, began to open up about his own past, a past he had kept locked away for decades. He told her about his parents, brilliant but emotionally distant scientists who had seen him more as a project than a son. He spoke of his time in the military, not in terms of heroics, but with a stark, unvarnished honesty. He described the suffocating heat of the desert, the crushing weight of responsibility for the men under his command, and the gnawing sense of loss that had followed him home. He confessed that building his empire had been a defense mechanism, a way to create a world of logic and control to hold the chaos of his past at bay. "In business, every problem has a solution, a variable you can control," he explained one evening, swirling the amber liquid in his whiskey glass. "Emotions, people, they're not like that. I never learned the language." "Maybe it's not a language you learn," she offered quietly. "Maybe it's one you just have to be brave enough to feel." He looked at her then, a long, searching look that made her feel more seen than she had ever felt in her life. The fortress was beginning to crumble, and in its place something vulnerable and profoundly human was emerging. For Elara, learning to accept his help was a challenge in itself. Her entire life had been a fight for independence, a refusal to be beholden to anyone. Now she was living in a billionaire's mansion, her every need provided for. It was a dizzying, disorienting experience. She insisted on contributing in some way. She found her solace, as always, in the garden. She spent hours among the roses, her hands in the rich soil, tending to the plants with a gentle, loving care. It was the one place on the estate where she felt she wasn't a guest or a project, but simply herself. Julian would often watch her from his study window. He saw the way she spoke to the flowers, the serene concentration on her face. He saw that she wasn't just weeding a garden. She was cultivating life, nurturing beauty in a place that had been touched by death, first his wife's, then almost her own. She was bringing the heart of the estate back to life, and in doing so, she was doing the same for him. One afternoon he found her there, carefully pruning the same Queen Elizabeth rosebush where she had been bitten. A faint, silvery scar, still tender to the touch, was the only remaining evidence of the attack. He stood beside her, his shadow falling over her. "I was thinking of having this section of the garden torn out," he said, his voice low. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with alarm. "Why would you do that?" "It's a painful memory," he said simply. She shook her head, a small, sad smile playing on her lips. "It's not," she corrected him gently. "It's the place where you saved my life. Tearing it out wouldn't erase the memory. It would just erase the proof that something good can come from something terrible." Her simple, profound wisdom silenced him. He had spent his life trying to control his environment, to eliminate any reminder of pain or weakness. She, on the other hand, understood that scars were not things to be hidden, but stories to be honored. He looked at the vibrant pink roses, at the woman kneeling in the dirt, and at the faint scar on her leg. and he saw not a sight of trauma, but a testament to resilience. Their growing closeness did not go unnoticed. The whispers among the staff grew louder, but they were no longer tinged with suspicion. Now they were filled with a sense of wonder. They saw a change in the man who had been their cold, distant employer for years. They heard him laugh, a real, unguarded sound for the first time. They saw him smile, a small, hesitant expression that seemed to transform his entire face. He was becoming a different person, or perhaps he was finally becoming the person he had been all along, before the walls went up. The final piece of his past that needed to be confronted arrived not in a person but in a phone call. It was from Sam. Elara had, with Julian's encouragement, told her brother the whole story, the edited version at least. She told him a kind employer had covered his medical bills and was helping her go back to school. One evening, as she and Julian sat on the patio, her phone rang. It was Sam. His voice, usually weak, was filled with an unaccustomed strength and excitement. "Elara, you won't believe it," he said, his words tumbling over each other. "The new treatment, it's working. The doctors, they're talking about remission, actual remission." Elara's hand flew to her mouth, tears of joy streaming down her face. It was the news she had been praying for, dreaming of, for years. She laughed and cried at the same time, her heart feeling like it was going to burst with a relief so profound it was almost painful. After she hung up, she turned to Julian, her face luminous with joy. "He's getting better," she whispered, the words filled with awe. "He's really getting better." Without thinking, she threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder, her body shaking with grateful sobs. He froze for a moment, his body rigid with surprise, before his own arms came up, slowly, hesitantly, to encircle her. He held her, his hand resting gently on her hair as she cried out years of pent-up fear and anxiety. He didn't offer platitudes or empty reassurances. He just held her, providing a silent, solid anchor in her storm of emotion. When her sobs finally subsided, she pulled back, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "I'm sorry," she stammered, wiping at her tears. "I didn't mean to." "Don't apologize," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't decipher. His hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs gently wiping away the last of her tears. They were so close now, the air between them charged with a new, palpable energy. The awkwardness was gone, replaced by an intensity that mirrored the moment in the garden. His grey eyes, no longer chips of ice, were dark and deep, filled with a raw vulnerability that stole her breath. He was seeing her, all of her, and he wasn't looking away. The line between them, the one that had been drawn, erased and redrawn so many times, finally dissolved into nothing. In that moment, they were no longer a billionaire and a maid, a savior and a victim. They were just Julian and Elara, two scarred souls who had found in each other an unexpected sanctuary. He lowered his head, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. When his lips met hers, it wasn't a kiss of passion or possession, but a kiss of quiet, profound recognition. It was a promise, a homecoming, a silent acknowledgement that the venom that had almost taken her life had, in the end, been the unlikely antidote that had saved them both.